The fog was so thick that Rob could barely see more than a few feet in front of him. He tightened his grip on the wheel, leaning forward to catch any glimpse of the road. Next to him, Ella stared anxiously out the window, her phone barely able to pick up a signal to guide them. "Look," she said, pointing to a wooden sign that materialized through the fog like a ghost. "Rest stop ahead." "Finally," Rob muttered, the tension in his voice clear. They'd been driving for hours, and the fog seemed to get denser by the minute. The rest stop emerged through the mist as a small gravel lot with an old, decrepit building in the center. Rob pulled in, and they both got out, shivering in the damp night air. The place looked abandoned. Dirt and grime streaked the windows, the door was warped and faded, and leaves littered the empty parking lot. A metal swing set creaked slowly in the breeze, untouched for what looked like years. "Not exactly cozy," Ella said with a nervous laugh, hugging herself as they walked toward the building. "Let's make this quick." They entered, the door groaning loudly on rusted hinges. Inside, a thick layer of dust blanketed the floors, and faded travel brochures sat in a cracked plastic holder. Old maps curled and yellowed on the walls, and the fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting eerie shadows across the room. "No one's been here for ages," Rob murmured, brushing his hand over a counter smeared with dust. "Creepy." Just as he said it, the lights blinked out completely, plunging them into darkness. Ella clutched his arm. "Rob, I don't like this. Let's just go." "Agreed," he said, guiding her back toward the door with his phone flashlight. They stepped out into the parking lot, eager to get back on the road. Rob started the car, but the fog was even thicker now, wrapping around them like a living thing. The world outside the car felt distorted, like they were peering through a warped glass. He pulled back onto the road, watching the rest stop disappear behind them in the rearview mirror. They both sighed with relief as they drove away. But only a few minutes later, a familiar building loomed in front of them, barely visible through the fog. The rest stop. "No way," Ella whispered, staring in horror. "How did we—" "We must have taken a wrong turn," Rob muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. They hadn't turned at all, and yet here they were, facing the same eerie building they'd just left. They drove again, this time paying close attention to every twist and turn in the road, keeping track of every landmark. But within minutes, they were back at the rest stop. It was as if the road had twisted back on itself, depositing them right back where they started. "Maybe we should just wait here until the fog clears," Ella said, her voice shaky. "Maybe it's the fog that's messing with us." They parked and waited in tense silence. Hours seemed to pass, yet the fog only thickened, settling heavier and colder around them. Eventually, Rob could no longer keep still. "I'm going to try the road again. This has to be some kind of trick." But as he pulled out of the lot, the engine sputtered and died. He turned the key, but nothing happened. The car sat, motionless and cold, like a corpse. "Did you hear that?" Ella susurró, su rostro pálido mientras echó un vistazo por la ventana. Rob followed her gaze, his heart skipping a beat. Shapes were moving in the fog, tall figures that shifted and melted back into the mist before they could fully see them. It was as if they were surrounded, the fog alive with dark shadows pressing closer to the car. A knock on the window made Ella scream. Rob spun around, but there was no one there. They were alone, yet somehow not alone at all. The fog pulsed, as if something unseen was drawing closer. "I don't think we can leave," Ella whispered, tears in her eyes. It's not letting us." Suddenly the radio crackled to life, tuning itself to an old, static-laden station. A distorted voice cut through the static, low and chilling. "Welcome to the rest stop. Please enjoy your stay." The fog swirled tighter around them, almost as if it were laughing, and the shapes in the mist grew bolder, pressing closer to the windows. The car felt like it was shrinking, the air thickening as shadows closed in. They were trapped, held by the relentless, ghostly fog, looping back to the rest stop over and over, never to leave. And as they sat, frozen in horror. The old building seemed to pulse with a life of its own, waiting, knowing they were now part of it, just like all the others who had come before. Ethan's tires hummed against the endless dark stretch of highway. It was the dead of night, and there wasn't a single car in sight. The road was hypnotic in its emptiness, only his headlights piercing the pitch black as he sped down the lonely interstate. Then his phone chimed. A text. He frowned, glancing at the screen. Unknown number. Slow down. There's an accident ahead. Ethan's brow furrowed, but he instinctively tapped the brakes, easing his car down to a cautious speed. Just as he rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated the twisted wreck of an overturned truck sprawled across the road. He swerved, narrowly avoiding it, his pulse racing. He looked back at the message, unsettled. How did they know? Shaking his head, he told himself it was a lucky coincidence. But a few miles later, his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Stay in the left lane. There's debris on the right. The message sent chills down his spine, but he obeyed, easing into the left lane. Not 10 seconds later, his headlights revealed a massive spill of shattered glass and twisted metal scraps scattered across the right lane. He drove on, unsettled, gripping the wheel as a gnawing fear began to creep up his spine. The night seemed darker than before, and the road stretched on endlessly. Then, another chime. Unknown number. You're being watched. Ethan's breath caught, and he scanned his mirrors and the road around him. Still, not a single soul or car in sight. Heart pounding, he checked the message again, his mind racing. There was no reason he should be receiving these warnings. And now, this. He pushed down the rising fear, telling himself to just keep driving. For a few minutes, the phone was silent. Just as he thought it might be over, it buzzed again. Unknown number. They're getting closer. His hands began to tremble as he stared at the message. They? There was no one around. The road was deserted, miles from civilization. He pressed harder on the gas, desperate to get past this endless stretch of highway. Moments later, his phone chimed with another message. Unknown number. Don't look in the rearview mirror. Without thinking, his gaze flicked to the mirror, and his blood went cold. In the dim light, he could make out shapes, a shadowy figure huddled in the back seat, barely visible. His heart leapt into his throat, and he jerked his head around, but there was nothing there. The back seat was empty. The phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I told you not to look. Ethan's chest heaved, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely think. His grip tightened on the wheel, and he willed himself to focus on the road. But the messages kept coming. Unknown number. Keep driving. Don't stop. They're coming. The car's engine roared as he pressed the gas pedal to the floor, desperate to escape whatever horror was haunting him. But with every mile, the messages grew more intense, more disturbing. Unknown number. You're running out of time. The road stretched on like a nightmare, each passing second thick with dread. He felt the suffocating presence around him growing stronger, the shadows in the car seeming to take on new shapes in his peripheral vision. He wanted to scream, but he kept his mouth shut, his eyes locked on the road. Finally, another message lit up his screen, making his blood freeze. Unknown number. Prepare for the crash. Ethan's eyes widened in horror, and before he could process what it meant, the road ahead revealed a sharp turn with no warning signs. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded, losing control on the slick pavement. His heart thundered as he fought the wheel, desperately trying to regain control, but it was no use. The car veered off the road, smashing through a guardrail before tumbling down an embankment. The world spun around him as metal crunched, glass shattered, and pain exploded through his body. When the car finally came to a stop, silence settled over the scene, thick and heavy. Ethan lay slumped against the steering wheel, blood trickling down his forehead. He was barely conscious, his vision blurring, the last shreds of awareness slipping away. Then his phone buzzed one final time. With a trembling hand, he reached for it, barely able to lift his head to read the message. Unknown number. Welcome to the end of the road, Ethan. As the screen dimmed, he could have sworn he saw shadowy figures emerging from the darkness, surrounding his wrecked car. They weren't there to help him, he knew that much. They'd been waiting for him all along, haunting him through every mile, and now they'd come to claim him. The last thing he heard was the faint sound of laughter echoing in the dark, closing in, before everything went black. The team was thrilled. Known for exploring the paranormal, they had traveled far to investigate this swamp. Whispers of hauntings and sightings of a glowing figure called the Marsh Lantern had intrigued them for months. Local legends claimed that those who ventured too close to the figure at night were never seen again, drawn in by the eerie light only to vanish into the murky depths. The team consisted of 4 members: Cass, the fearless leader, Jonah, the tech guy, Rhea, the historian, and Luke, the skeptic who debunked claims more often than he believed them. Armed with cameras, audio equipment, and high-powered flashlights, they set out under a full moon to capture any sign of the phenomenon. As they waded into the dense fog blanketing the swamp, the world seemed to grow quieter. The sounds of insects and frogs disappeared, leaving an unsettling silence. Cass switched on the camera and addressed the group. "We're about to enter the heart of one of the most haunted locations in the country," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Legend says the Marsh Lantern is a ghostly figure that appears as a flickering light, luring travelers into the swamp. Locals say it's the spirit of an old ferryman who vanished one misty night and has been searching for lost souls ever since." The team pressed forward, weaving through thick trees and wading into shallow pools, their flashlights casting thin beams through the dense fog. Every so often, they heard what sounded like footsteps sloshing in the water behind them, but when they turned, there was nothing. Finally, they reached a small clearing. The air felt different here, thicker and colder. Rhea checked her thermometer and noticed a drastic temperature drop. This doesn't feel right," she said, rubbing her arms. Suddenly, Jonah's equipment started buzzing. "Something's here. High EMF levels," he whispered, his eyes wide. Then a faint light appeared through the mist, a soft, eerie glow that hovered just above the ground, pulsing as if beckoning them closer. "Is that—" Cass began, her heart racing. "The Marsh Lantern," Rhea finished, her voice trembling. Against her better judgment, Cass moved forward, drawn to the light. The others followed, watching the glow drift deeper into the swamp, occasionally flickering as if it were a lantern being swung back and forth. They followed it, each step taking them further from the clearing and deeper into the heart of the swamp. As they got closer, the light grew brighter. Jonah raised his camera to capture the phenomenon, but his screen flickered and the footage distorted with strange static patterns. "Is anyone else's equipment going haywire?" he asked, tapping his camera. Luke shook his flashlight, which had started to dim and flicker on its own. The light suddenly stopped moving. It hovered a few yards away, as if waiting. The team gathered in a tight cluster, captivated by the glow. Then, without warning, the light split into several smaller orbs, surrounding them in a circle. Each orb pulsed in unison, bathing the swamp in an unnatural, sickly glow. A low, guttural moan rose from the depths of the swamp, and the water around them began to ripple. Cass felt a chill snake down her spine. It felt like they were being watched. "Let's get out of here," Luke said, his voice shaky, the usual bravado gone. But as they tried to turn back, the fog thickened, obscuring the path they'd come from. The light seemed to shift, blocking every route they took, guiding them deeper into the swamp. panic set in. Cass's heart pounded as she struggled to keep the team together. They pushed forward, blindly stumbling through the thick fog, but every step brought them back to the same spot, where the pulsing orbs floated, watching them. Rhea screamed as something cold and slimy wrapped around her ankle, dragging her down. She fought and kicked, but whatever had hold of her wouldn't let go. The others tried to help, but they were frozen with terror as the water seemed to come alive around them, forming grasping tendrils. "Help me!" Rhea cried, her voice muffled as she was pulled beneath the surface. Before they could process what had happened, Jonah was next. A pale skeletal hand reached out from the water, grabbing his shoulder and pulling him down with inhuman strength. His scream echoed, cut short as he vanished beneath the murky surface. Cass and Luke were all that remained, surrounded by the pulsing orbs of light. They huddled together, shaking, helplessly watching as one of the lights drifted forward and hovered inches from their faces. Cass saw her reflection in the light's surface, a hollow, terrified version of herself. And within the light, she caught a glimpse of other faces. Rhea's, Jonah's, countless others, their eyes wide with fear, trapped within the glow. They're inside it," she stammered, horror dawning on her. It's feeding on us." Luke stumbled back, trying to escape, but the light surged forward, engulfing him in its glow. His screams faded as his face appeared within the orb, his eyes blank and lifeless. Cass was alone now, surrounded by the pulsing lights, the swamp water creeping higher around her ankles. Desperate, she splashed through the water, fighting against the invisible force pulling her back. The lights pulsed faster, the eerie moaning intensifying, echoing through the swamp as if it were alive with voices from beyond. Cass's strength waned, her vision blurring as the lights drew closer, their glow swallowing her whole. By morning, there was no trace of the team. Their equipment was found scattered along the edge of the swamp, cameras destroyed, footage erased. Locals who ventured near the marsh claimed to see new lights drifting through the mist, new, frightened faces staring out from within the marsh lantern, forever lost in the depths of the haunted swamp.